Welcome back, everyone, to Data Science for Everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about sampling. Let's get started. So, to start off, why do we actually want to do sampling? So, sampling is going to be used whenever it is not possible or practical to include the entire research population in your study, which is usually going to be the case. Sampling is the process of selecting a few from the many in order to carry out critical empirical research. In qualitative descriptive sampling, the case is selected based on what we can learn from the case, and the goal is rarely to make inferences about the wider population on this discovery. In quantitative research, the point is to take a sample and make inferences about the rest of the population based on that sample. It needs to be accepted from the outset that the sample represents a form of trade off between the desirable and the attainable. But this is more often the case in statistical sampling than it is in descriptive sampling. With both approaches, it may well be much more informative to study the entire population, but this would almost always be impossible based on the cost and time. For this reason, we sample. So, the characteristics and composition of scale of a sample that give weight to any findings that emerge from the investigation. Take care when selecting a sampling technique. There are a number of different approaches to sampling, and choice of approach should be influenced largely by the purpose of the investigation. Quantitative research will tend to be using probabilistic sampling techniques. Qualitative research will tend to use purposive sampling. The population and sample. How do we go about selecting a sample, and what do we select with the sample, and how do we select it from? Your research population is the entire set of individuals about which inference will be made. The expressed opinion of a small number of the population is used to infer the preferences within the entire population. This type of example should indicate that inferences could sometimes be wrong. We need to be wary of making exaggerated claims or extended generalizations based on a relatively small samples. Remember, you are making a trade off, but that does not necessarily mean that your discovery has no significance. You just need to be honest with your reader when you put forward your inferences. Make them aware of the sample, and also make them aware that it is impossible to account for all individual traits. This is discovery based, is the best possible estimation. Probability or probabilistic sampling. These conditions are that the sample is representative of the wider population, the wider population is properly defined, and sample was drawn from a population using probability sampling methods. In order to provide a statistical basis for generalizing from a research study to a wider population, probability sampling must be applied. There are a number of techniques available that allow for statistical generalization, but remember that the logic of statistical generalization demands that certain conditions must be met. The ability of such sampling to produce a representative sample will depend on the adequacy of the sampling frame for which the sample was drawn, any bias in response and non response from the selected sample units. A simple random sample. So, random sampling is a procedure of creating a sample where each member of the defined population has an equal chance of being selected for inclusion, and the selection of one participant depends on the selection of any other from that population. Stratified random sampling. Very often, a research population will have recognized groups or strata within the population. There are two ways of dealing with this. If you wish to include the distinct groups as an element of the sampling design, one, stratified random sampling, and two, we could use cluster sampling. Stratified random sampling. Stratified random sampling allows for random selection within each group or strata. This is a two-stage process. First, the groups are identified and the research population is listed within their groups. Second, A random sample is taken from the group in the same way a simple random sample would be drawn from the entire research population. It is important here to remember that each group should be represented in the sample in equal proportion to the size that that group is in relation to the entire research population. Each group within the research population should be taken as a separate population. Then simple random sampling can be carried out to draw the correct number from the group using one of the techniques discussed in the previous section. Cluster sampling. When the research population is very large and often spread over a wide geographical area, or groups demonstrate a common characteristic that has a direct relationship to the main variable in the research question. Quota sampling. Quota sampling, or convenience sampling, is based on the researcher's access to the sample. With quota sampling, a required percentage of the total research population is identified, ergo the quota. Purposive sampling. Purposeful sampling is selecting information-rich cases for study in depth. Information-rich cases are those from which one can learn a great deal about the issues of certain importance to the purpose of the research. Two possible approaches to this sampling technique. A priori sampling establishes a framework before sampling begins. Two, snowball sampling is an inductive approach to growing the sample as the research progresses. Overall, sampling is a vital stage in the research process. The outcomes, rigor, and trustworthiness of your research all rely on the robustness of your sample and how that sample was identified. Sampling technique applied must be appropriate to your research goals and conform to the research tradition you have chosen for your investigation. Any claims you make concerning generalization, applicability, transferability, and significance will all be judged in your view of the empirical evidence on the source of that evidence. But we all must be aware that the reality and theory are rarely a perfect match. Compromise is inevitable, and research and all sampling has its limitations. If you guys like this, please comment, subscribe, and hit that like button, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.